By the winter of 1913, the marble hall of the Neues Palais in Potsdam had already stood for almost a century and a half. Completed in 1769 as the central festival hall of Frederick the Great's fanfaronade, his own word for this excess of marble, stone, and gilt, it anchored the western axis of Sanssouci Park, facing Europe with a façade of victory. Now, beneath the painted vault where Charles-Amédée-Philippe van Lo's Ganymede rises toward Olympus, electric light hums inside crystal chandeliers, their reflections sliding across the 600-square-metre inlaid marble floor that Frederick once treated as a stone tapestry. Servants move silently along the curve of black and white bands, adjusting chairs for a banquet that will double as a rehearsal of power. At the far end, Kaiser Wilhelm the Second tests the echo with a clipped remark. The room answers with a faint delay, as if mocking his need to be heard. This hall was built to impress Europe. Tonight, it records the anxiety of an empire that believes it cannot be ignored, and that history will not indulge for long. In 1763, as diplomats across Europe signed treaties ending the 7 Years' War, Frederick II of Prussia ordered construction of a new palace at the western boundary of his Sanssouci estate. The war had nearly destroyed him. Russian armies had occupied Berlin. Austrian forces had pushed to the gates of Silesia. Only shifting alliances and exhaustion among his enemies had allowed Prussia to survive. Frederick understood what survival meant in the language of 18th-century monarchy, not merely holding territory, but demonstrating that the state remained capable of grandeur. The palace he commissioned would serve no practical need. Sanssouci already existed as his preferred retreat. The Stadtschloss in Potsdam provided administrative space. What Frederick wanted was not another residence but a monument to defiance, architecture as propaganda, a brag rendered in 3 dimensions. He called it, without irony, a fanfaronade. The word appears in his correspondence and in later guidebooks, a French term meaning ostentatious display, a flourish of trumpets, an excess calculated to overwhelm. The architects he assembled, Johann Gottfried Buring, Heinrich Ludwig Manger, Carl von Gontard, and Jean-Laurent Leguet, understood the assignment. They designed a massive 3-winged Baroque complex stretching 200 meters across the western end of the park, crowned with a copper dome held aloft by statues of the 3 Graces. The façade bristled with pilasters, balustrades, and sculptural groups. Inside, room after room would be layered with stucco, gilt, and marble. The building would announce to anyone approaching from the west that Prussia had not merely survived the war, but emerged wealthy enough to waste resources on beauty. At the heart of this fanfaronade, Gontard planned the Marble Hall. He modeled it on the Marble Hall of Potsdam's Stadtschloss, a 2-story space with colossal Corinthian columns rising to support a coffered dome. Round arched windows on 2 levels would flood the interior with light. The walls would be lined with polished stone. But it was the floor that Frederick demanded as the centerpiece. Across 600 square meters, craftsmen would lay an intricate pattern of inlaid marble and colored stone, swirling bands of black, white, gray, and cream curving in Rococo arabesques. Contemporary descriptions compared it to an oriental carpet, translated into mineral form. The stone came from quarries across Europe. The design required that each piece be cut, polished, and fitted by hand. When sunlight struck the surface, the floor would shimmer with the depth of a tapestry, forcing visitors to lower their gaze before raising it to the dome. Above, Gontard commissioned Charles-Amédée-Philippe van Lo to paint the ceiling. Van Loo, a French artist already known for grand mythological scenes, delivered a composition showing Ganymede carried to Olympus by Zeus in the form of an eagle. Around the walls, 4 large canvases depicted classical stories: Bacchus and Ariadne, the Judgment of Paris, the Rape of Helen, the Sacrifice of Iphigenia. Each painting reinforced the same theme: divine favor, heroic destiny, beauty seized and elevated. The hall's iconography was not subtle. It positioned Prussia and Frederick himself as chosen by fate and worthy of immortal company. Construction proceeded rapidly. By 1769, the Neues Palais stood complete. Visitors entering the Marble Hall for the first time reported being overwhelmed. The scale, the light, the reflective surfaces, the dome painted with ascending gods, It was a space designed to stun. But Frederick himself rarely used it. The palace opened for festivals, for visiting dignitaries, for moments when the Prussian court needed to perform grandeur. Between these occasions, the marble hall stood empty. The inlaid floor, pristine and unscratched, reflected only the slow passage of daylight across the windows. It had been made to impress, but Frederick understood that true power lay in withholding as much as in display. The fanfaronade was most effective when it remained slightly out of reach, a spectacle reserved for moments that mattered. Architectural historians later noted the contradiction. Frederick built the palace immediately after a war that had nearly bankrupted his state. Resources that might have rebuilt villages or repaired infrastructure were instead poured into stone and gilt. Yet Frederick understood something about 18th century statecraft that his critics often missed. Symbols mattered as much as armies. A ruined kingdom that could still commission a palace sent a message to Europe's chancelleries. Prussia was not merely alive, it was confident enough to waste money. The marble hall, with its imported stone and hand-fitted patterns, embodied that confidence. It was stone made to behave like fabric, rigid material forced into flowing forms, a physical metaphor for trying to make power look effortless. When the final invoices were tallied, the Neues Palais had consumed more than 2 million thalers. Frederick never apologized for the expense. He had survived the war. The building proved it. Across Europe, monarchs and ambassadors took note. The palace entered the mental map of European power as a landmark of Prussian resilience. Its rooms and halls would remain, waiting for the next ruler who needed a stage. The floor, in those first years, bore no footsteps except those of caretakers and the occasional guided tour. It was a boast held in reserve, stone waiting to record history it could not yet imagine. It was conceived as proof that Prussia had survived. No one in 1769 imagined that, a century and a half later, this same floor would record the last footsteps of a different empire. Frederick the Great died in 1786. With his death, the Neues Palais lost its principal author. The building passed into the hands of successors who had not commissioned it and felt no obligation to honor its intended use. Frederick William the Second, Frederick's nephew, preferred other residences. Frederick William III occasionally visited, but did not make the palace a center of court life. The Marble Hall, designed for grand receptions, hosted only sporadic events. For decades, the palace functioned less as a residence than as a kind of architectural reserve, maintained, inventoried, occasionally opened for state functions, but not truly inhabited. Archival records from the early 19th century document this dormancy. Estate inventories list the Marble Hall's paintings, chandeliers, and furnishings as part of the royal collection, noting their condition and location, but recording little activity. Maintenance accounts show expenditures for roof repairs, stucco restoration, and window glazing, the routine work of preserving a building, not the costs of running an active household. The palace had become a shell, a Baroque theater kept in working order but rarely used for performances. The inlaid marble floor gathered a thin film of dust. Caretakers polished it periodically, but the absence of regular foot traffic meant the stone retained its original polish. The pattern remained sharp, the joints tight. The floor waited. Around 1859, the palace's status began to shift. Crown Prince Frederick William, later Emperor Frederick III, and his wife Victoria, Princess Royal of Britain and eldest daughter of Queen Victoria, chose the Neues Palais as their summer residence. The decision brought a different kind of life into the building. Where Frederick the Great had conceived the palace as a stage for state power, the Crown Prince and Princess used it as a family home. Photographs and letters from this period show domestic routines unfolding in rooms designed for spectacle, children's lessons in the galleries, informal dinners in the state apartments, walks in the gardens. The Marble Hall itself remained a ceremonial space reserved for receptions and formal events, but the palace around it became lived in. Victoria, raised in the relative informality of the British court, found the Neues Palais overwhelming. Her letters described the scale of the rooms, the challenges of heating such vast spaces, the sense of living inside a monument. She and Frederick made modifications where they could, adding modern conveniences, rearranging furniture, softening the Baroque grandeur with Victorian domesticity. But the architecture resisted transformation. The marble hall, in particular, could not be domesticated. Its scale and decoration demanded to be taken seriously. Even when used for family gatherings, it imposed a certain formality, a reminder that this was not an ordinary home. In 1888, Frederick III ascended to the German throne. His reign lasted 99 days. Dying of throat cancer, he spent much of his brief time as emperor at the Neues Palais, which he briefly renamed Friedrichskron, Frederick's crown. The renaming gesture, recorded in official documents, reveals how easily rulers attempted to rebrand inherited architecture. A moat was dug around portions of the palace, as if medieval fortification could somehow anchor a modern emperor's legacy. But Frederick died before the new name could take hold. His son, Wilhelm II, inherited both the throne and the palace. He discarded the name Friedrichskron and restored the original, Neues Palais. The moat was filled in. The building returned to being what it had always been, Frederick the Great's fanfaronade, now waiting for a new interpreter. During these decades, the Marble Hall's role remained ambiguous. It hosted occasional state dinners and receptions, moments when the Prussian and later German court needed to perform continuity and grandeur. But much of the time, it stood empty. Guidebooks from the mid-19th century describe it as one of the palace's highlights, open for visitors on certain days, a space to be admired more than used. The inlaid floor, still in excellent condition, appeared in these guidebooks as a marvel of craftsmanship. Writers lingered on descriptions of the stone patterns, the play of light across polished surfaces, the way the curves led the eye in slow spirals, but they rarely mentioned the room's original purpose, to intimidate. By the mid-1800s, Frederick's fanfaronade had softened into aesthetic curiosity, a beautiful room in a palace that had outlived its first meaning. The floor itself recorded this shift. Where once it had been meant to force ambassadors and courtiers to acknowledge Prussian power before even reaching the throne, it now bore the slower, more contemplative footsteps of tourists and guidebook writers. The pattern remained identical, but the context had changed. The stone that Frederick intended as a declaration of dominance had become, instead, a surface for aesthetic appreciation. History had not destroyed the boast, it had simply stopped listening. Preservation records from this period show routine maintenance, but no major restoration. The Marble Hall's paintings were cleaned, the chandeliers occasionally regaled, the floor polished according to a regular schedule. But there was no urgency to the work. The building was not in crisis, it was simply aging quietly, a Baroque monument drifting through the 19th century, maintained by a state that had inherited it but did not quite know what to do with it. The palace was neither abandoned nor fully embraced. It existed in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for a ruler who would need it again. Before it became Kaiser Wilhelm II's home, the Neues Palais spent decades as an echoing shell, an elaborate frame in search of a story. The story that would finally arrive would be far darker than Frederick's fanfares. Wilhelm II became German emperor in June of 1888, 3 months after his father's death. He was 29 years old, ambitious, and deeply conscious of his position as the symbolic head of a recently unified empire. Where his father had preferred restraint and his grandfather had embodied Prussian discipline, Wilhelm cultivated a public image of bombast and theatrical confidence. He loved military parades, naval reviews, and grand ceremonial occasions. He spoke often and loudly, delivering speeches that mixed imperial ambition with personal grievance. Contemporary observers described him as a man who needed an audience, who measured his importance by the volume of applause and the scale of the stage. For such a ruler, the Neues Palais was ideal. Wilhelm made the palace his preferred residence almost immediately. Unlike his father and grandfather, who had used it sparingly, Wilhelm spent several months each year at the Neues Palais, eventually making it his principal home. He understood what Frederick the Great had understood, that architecture could perform political work. The Neues Palais was not merely large, it was ostentatiously large, a building designed to overwhelm. Wilhelm, famed for his love of display, moved into the loudest structure his ancestors had built. It was a choice that revealed as much about his psychology as about his politics. He wanted to be seen, and the Neues Palais was built to ensure that anyone entering it could see nothing else. But Wilhelm did not simply occupy the palace as Frederick had left it. Almost immediately, he began a campaign of modernization. The building, constructed in the 1760s, lacked basic amenities by late 19th century standards. There was no central heating, rooms were warmed by individual fireplaces and ceramic stoves, inadequate for the scale of the spaces in the Prussian winters. There were no modern bathrooms. Washing facilities were primitive, hidden behind paneling and screens. Lighting relied on candles and oil lamps, expensive to maintain and insufficient for the vast halls. Wilhelm ordered sweeping changes. By the early 1890s, steam heating had been installed throughout the palace. Radiators and heating grills were integrated discreetly into the Baroque interiors, hidden behind decorative panels so as not to disrupt the visual coherence of the rooms. Modern bathrooms were constructed in the private apartments, though Empress Augusta Victoria's difficulties with the climate were never fully resolved. Later guidebooks note that she bathed in a specially heated cupboard to avoid the persistent chill. Most dramatically, Wilhelm ordered the electrification of the chandeliers. By the turn of the century, the marble hall's crystal fixtures glowed with electric light, their reflections multiplying across the polished floor in a way that candlelight had never achieved. A Berlin tourism description from the early 1900s notes the effect. A Baroque fanfaronade, now illuminated by modern technology, 18th century grandeur powered by 19th century engineering. In 1889, Wilhelm commissioned an underground corridor connecting the communes, the two service buildings flanking the palace, to the main residence. The corridor allowed servants, food, and supplies to circulate invisibly, out of sight of the imperial family and their guests. It was an architectural embodiment of social hierarchy, the machinery of daily life hidden beneath the surface, preserving the illusion of effortless splendor. Above ground, the palace appeared as Frederick had intended, a monument to power and permanence. Below, a modern infrastructure of tunnels, heating ducts, and electrical conduits kept that illusion running. Wilhelm's relationship to the marble hall itself was complex. He used the room frequently, hosting state dinners, receptions, and ceremonial occasions. But he also understood its limitations. The hall was too large for intimate gatherings, too formal for daily use. Its acoustics, designed to amplify speeches and music, could make ordinary conversation awkward, each word echoing slightly before fading into the dome. Wilhelm reportedly tested the echo during his first weeks in residence, delivering clipped remarks to empty air and listening as the room returned them with a faint delay. He liked the effect. The hall was a sounding board, literally and metaphorically, a space that magnified whatever was said within it. For a ruler who measured his importance by the volume of his voice, it was perfect. The inlaid marble floor now registered a new kind of light. Electric reflections slid across its surface, sharper and steadier than the flicker of candles. The stone patterns, designed to be viewed by 18th century illumination, took on a different character under electric chandeliers. The blacks became deeper, the whites more stark, the curves more precise. Technology changed the atmosphere, but not the underlying purpose. The room still existed to impress, to amplify, to make anyone standing in it feel small in comparison to the power it represented. Wilhelm understood this. He did not need to alter the decoration or the layout. He simply needed to turn on the lights. Palace records from this period show a household in full operation. Photographs document the imperial family on the palace steps, Wilhelm in military uniform, Augusta Victoria in formal gowns, their children arranged by height and protocol. Court calendars list audiences, dinners, church services, and receptions. Household accounts detail expenditures for food, wine, flowers, and entertainment. The Neues Palais, dormant for much of the 19th century, had become a functioning imperial residence, its rooms filled with the routines of monarchy. Yet beneath the activity, the building retained its original character. It had been designed to boast, and boasting was what it did best. By 1903, Wilhelm had fully transformed the palace into his own. The modernizations were complete. the household routines established. The marble hall was no longer just Frederick's brag, it was Wilhelm's sounding board. Yet the louder the room became, the more fragile the world beyond its windows would prove to be. Europe in the early 20th century was entering a period of escalating tensions, naval arms races, and entangling alliances. The same industrial capacity that allowed Wilhelm to electrify his chandeliers was building battleships, artillery, and machine guns. The marble hall, lit by modern technology, reflected an empire that believed itself invincible. The floor's inlaid patterns, unchanged since 1769, would soon bear the footsteps of men who did not yet know they were rehearsing for catastrophe. By the 1890s, the Neues Palais functioned not only as a stage for Europe, but as a lived-in residence with all the ordinary complexities of domestic life. Photographs from this period show the imperial family in informal moments, children on the terraces, picnics in the gardens, lessons in the state apartments. Court records and household accounts reconstruct a daily rhythm that mixed ceremonial grandeur with mundane routine. Breakfast was served in the private apartments. Wilhelm held morning audiences in designated reception rooms. The children, 6 sons and 1 daughter, attended lessons supervised by tutors and governesses, their schoolrooms arranged in wings of the palace designed for entirely different purposes. Church services were held in the palace chapel on Sundays. Evenings brought informal family gatherings, musical performances, or quiet reading in the libraries, yet the building resisted domestication. The Neues Palais had been designed for spectacle, and its architecture imposed itself on every activity. Hallways were too long for casual conversation. Ceilings soared far above the heads of children doing arithmetic. Even the private apartments, though modified with modern heating and bathrooms, retained the proportions and decorative schemes of Frederick's Baroque vision. To live in the Neues Palais was to perform daily life on a stage built for grander narratives. The subterranean service corridor, completed in 1889, became essential to maintaining this performance. Servants used the tunnel to move between the communes and the palace, transporting meals, laundry, and supplies without being seen. Above ground, the illusion of effortless aristocratic life continued. Below, an entire infrastructure of labor kept that illusion intact. Technical drawings preserved in the palace archives show the corridor's layout, a vaulted passageway wide enough for carts, lit by electric lamps, branching into service stairs that emerged discreetly into the main building. It was a spatial diagram of class hierarchy rendered in brick and stone. Augusta Victoria, Wilhelm's wife, struggled with the palace's scale and climate. Letters and later memoirs describe her difficulties with the drafty rooms and the persistent chill that no amount of heating could fully dispel. The solution, a specially heated bathing cupboard, became a minor piece of palace lore, repeated in guidebooks as evidence of the gap between architectural grandeur and human comfort. The Empress, living in one of Europe's most magnificent buildings, had to retreat to a cramped enclosure to stay warm. The anecdote reveals the tension at the heart of the Neues Palais. It was designed to impress guests, not to shelter inhabitants. The marble hall, during these years, acquired a new layer of meaning. While it remained primarily a ceremonial space, it also hosted informal family events, musical rehearsals, children's gatherings on rainy afternoons, quiet walkthroughs when the palace felt too confining. Photographs from this period are rare, but estate records mention occasions when the hall was opened for family use rather than state functions. These moments left no formal documentation, only traces in logbooks and servants' accounts. The inlaid floor, designed to bear the weight of ambassadors and courtiers, now occasionally registered the lighter, quicker footsteps of children. This domestic history exists in fragments. There are no diaries describing daily life in the marble hall, no detailed accounts of what it felt like to grow up in rooms designed for kings. But the physical evidence remains. Scuff marks repaired during later restorations, wear patterns in the floor's inlaid stone, concentrated near doorways and windows, areas where repeated traffic over decades left subtle traces. These marks, invisible to casual visitors but documented in conservation reports, tell a story the official archives do not. The palace was not only a monument, it was a home, and homes accumulate. Histories that monumental architecture tries to erase. Court calendars from the 1890s and early 1900s list a constant stream of activity. Wilhelm held audiences with ministers, generals, diplomats, and visiting dignitaries. He hosted hunting parties, military reviews, and garden parties. The palace staff, hofmarschall, chamberlains, domestic supervisors, cooks, gardeners, and footmen, numbered in the dozens, their names recorded in payroll ledgers and household accounts. The Neues Palais was a small city unto itself, with its own hierarchies, routines, and internal politics. To manage it required not only wealth but an elaborate system of protocol and supervision. Yet beneath the routines, the building asserted its original purpose. Every corridor, every doorway, every decorative detail reminded inhabitants and staff that this was not an ordinary residence. It was Frederick's fanfaronade, a Baroque monument repurposed for modern imperial life. The tension between monument and home defined the palace's atmosphere. Wilhelm could modernize the heating and electrify the chandeliers, but he could not make the marble hall feel intimate. The room's scale, its acoustics, its ceiling painted with ascending gods, these elements resisted any interpretation except grandeur. The floor, during these years, became a kind of palimpsest. Its surface layer remained Frederick's Rococo patterns, unchanged since 1769. But beneath that visual constancy, the stone absorbed new meanings. It had been a boast, then a dormant curiosity. Now it was part of a lived environment, traversed daily by people whose concerns ranged from imperial diplomacy to children's colds to the logistics of moving furniture. The stone recorded none of this explicitly. It simply endured, polished, and maintained, its curves and colors intact. But the meanings projected onto it shifted with each generation, each regime, each set of footsteps. By the early 1900s, the Neues Palais under Wilhelm was simultaneously a stage for Europe and a home with drafts and school books and worn carpets. The contradiction was never resolved. The palace remained what Frederick had made it, too grand for comfort, too theatrical for genuine privacy, but undeniably effective as a symbol of power. Visitors entering the marble hall were meant to be overwhelmed, and overwhelmed they were. But the people who lived there, Wilhelm, Augusta Victoria, their children, the household staff, experienced the building differently. For them, the marble hall was not a revelation but a familiar space, impressive but also slightly burdensome, a room that demanded respect even when no one was watching. The palace under Wilhelm was not only a stage for Europe, it was a home with drafts and school books and worn carpets. Yet the room that mattered most was still the one built to be louder than life. The marble hall reached its fullest expression not in daily use, but in ceremonial performance. During Wilhelm II's reign, the room functioned as an instrument of soft power, a space where diplomacy, status, and imperial ambition converged in carefully choreographed displays. State dinners held in the marble hall were not merely meals but political theater, designed to overawe foreign guests and reinforce Germany's position in European hierarchy. Every element, its scale, its decoration, its acoustics, its lighting, worked in concert to produce a single effect. The visitor should feel small, Germany should feel immense. Period guidebooks and tourist descriptions emphasized the lavish banqueting halls of the Neues Palais, singling out the marble hall and the adjacent grotto hall as highlights. Travel writers in the early 1900s described the experience of entering from the vestibule, the sudden expansion of space, the cascade of light from electrified chandeliers, the painted dome overhead, and below, the inlaid floor stretching like a mineral sea. One summary characterized the palace as a palace for guests, not for living, a building whose primary function was not shelter but spectacle. State dinners followed rigid protocols. The long banquet table, set beneath the chandeliers, bisected the room lengthwise, its white linen and crystal glassware arranged with geometric precision. Paired rows of gilded chairs lined either side. Place cards determined seating by rank, royalty closest to the center, ministers and generals flanking them, lesser dignitaries toward the ends. The arrangement was both a social map and a political statement. To sit near the head of the table was to be acknowledged. To sit at the periphery was to understand one's marginality. The table itself, draped and weighted with silver and porcelain, partially obscured the inlaid floor, covering sections of the stone pattern with its legs and linens. What had been the room's visual centerpiece became, during banquets, a pedestal for diplomatic performance. Photographs from this period, though rare, document the effect. In some images, the table is laid but empty, ready for guests. In others, dignitaries in formal dress stand in rows, their postures stiff with protocol. The marble hall appears in these photographs as a kind of architectural amplifier, magnifying the importance of whatever occurred within it. The room's decoration, the mythological paintings, the colossal columns, the dome painted with divine ascent, provided a visual argument that the events unfolding beneath were historically significant, touched by grandeur, worthy of being remembered. Wilhelm II used the marble hall to host visiting monarchs and heads of state. Records and photographs document receptions for King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, who visited in 1901 during military maneuvers near Potsdam. The king was received with full ceremonial honors, a formal dinner in the marble hall, speeches exchanged beneath. The painted dome, toasts offered in crystal glasses that reflected the electric light. For Victor Emmanuel, the visit was diplomatic courtesy. For Wilhelm, it was an opportunity to perform imperial confidence on a stage designed for exactly that purpose. Society columns and court circulars from this period describe other events: balls that filled the marble hall with dancers, concerts that exploited the room's acoustics, receptions where hundreds of guests circulated beneath the chandeliers. Each event followed similar logic. The room's scale forced guests to acknowledge their own smallness. The decoration insisted on continuity with classical tradition and divine favor. The lighting, electric by this point, bright and unwavering, eliminated shadows, creating an atmosphere of relentless visibility. There was nowhere to hide in the marble hall. Every gesture, every expression, every whispered remark occurred under conditions of maximum exposure. Yet the room's effectiveness as a tool of intimidation depended on context. In an era when Europe's great powers competed through displays of industrial and military strength, the marble hall functioned as architectural evidence of Germany's arrival. It was not merely old, though its Baroque origins lent historical legitimacy, but also modern, electrified, and heated, a fusion of inherited grandeur and contemporary technology. Visitors from other courts could not help but compare. Did their own palaces combine tradition and modernity so seamlessly? Could their own banquet halls match this scale, this light, this overwhelming density of decoration? The marble hall asked these questions silently, through architecture rather than words. The inlaid floor, during banquets, played a paradoxical role. Frederick the Great had designed it as the room's centerpiece, the element that would first arrest a visitor's gaze. But when the long table was in place, the floor became partially hidden, its curves and colors interrupted by furniture and fabric. What remained visible, the margins around the table, the areas near the walls, became a kind of frame, emphasizing the table's centrality. The floor, once the dominant visual element, now served to support and elevate the social performance occurring above it. Its meaning had shifted from declaration to foundation, from active boast to passive infrastructure. Conservation reports from later decades note wear patterns concentrated along the pathways guests would have taken, from the main entrance toward the table, from the walls toward the center, from the musician's alcove toward the seating area. These patterns, etched into the stone over years of use, map the choreography of imperial hospitality. The floor records, in physical form, the routes that power and protocol dictated. Even without documentary evidence, a trained conservator can read the stone and reconstruct where people stood, where they walked, where the traffic concentrated. Not all. Guests were impressed. Some memoirs and diplomatic correspondence describe the Neues Palais and its marble hall with detachment or veiled critique. The scale could feel oppressive, the decoration could seem excessive. The combination of Baroque bombast and modern electrification struck some observers as aesthetically confused, neither authentically historical nor genuinely contemporary. These dissenting views rarely appeared in published accounts during Wilhelm's reign. It would have been diplomatically unwise. But they surfaced later. in private letters and post-war memoirs, as Europe reassessed the pre-war world. Banquets in the Marble Hall were meant to reassure Europe of Germany's strength and refinement. The room was supposed to project confidence, continuity, and cultural sophistication. For many guests, it succeeded. But the men who walked its patterned floor during those pre-war dinners, diplomats, generals, ministers, monarchs, would soon meet again, not under chandeliers, but under mobilized skies. The Marble Hall could stage power, but it could not prevent the forces that would unmake the world it represented. Wilhelm II's reign coincided with a period of intense military culture in Europe, particularly in Germany, where the army held outsized influence in politics and society. Large-scale maneuvers, Kaiser maneuver, became annual events, exercises where tens of thousands of troops rehearsed scenarios of mobilization and combat. These maneuvers were part spectacle, part strategic training, and part political theater. Wilhelm, who styled himself supreme warlord, presided over many of these exercises, using them to assert his authority and to test his generals. Critics within the military sometimes challenged the exercise's realism. General Waldersee, once a senior figure in the German army, fell from favor after openly questioning Wilhelm's conduct during maneuvers in 1891, an incident that illustrated the Kaiser's sensitivity to any perceived challenge to his military competence. The Neues Palais became entangled in this militarized culture. While the palace itself was not a military headquarters, it served as a logistical and ceremonial base during maneuver seasons. Visiting monarchs and senior officers were received at Potsdam before traveling to observe exercises in the field. Travel records document visits by Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, who came to the Neues Palais en route to maneuvers, exchanging formal courtesies with Wilhelm before both men departed to watch troops rehearse for wars neither imagined would actually occur. Diplomatic histories and memoirs describe key conversations held at the Neues Palais in the years leading to the First World War. In 1913 and early 1914, Wilhelm hosted crown councils and strategic discussions with Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, Moltke the Younger, and other senior advisors. These meetings did not take place exclusively in the Marble Hall. The palace had many suitable rooms for confidential discussions, but the setting mattered. To deliberate war scenarios in a palace built as a monument to military victory reinforced a particular mindset: that war was manageable, that Germany could control events, that rehearsal would translate seamlessly into execution. Contemporary observers noted Wilhelm's tendency to blur the line between ceremonial display and military rehearsal. He loved parades, reviews, and the visual spectacle of massed troops. For him, maneuvers were not merely training, but performances of power, opportunities to demonstrate Germany's military readiness to foreign dignitaries and to his own people. The Neues Palais, with its combination of Baroque grandeur and modern infrastructure, became a natural extension of this performative militarism. Visiting officers and monarchs could be received in the Marble Hall, dine beneath painted gods of war and heroism, and then depart to watch artillery exercises or cavalry charges. The continuity between architectural spectacle and military display reinforced the idea that both were instruments of the same project, asserting Germany's dominance in Europe. The Marble Hall itself never hosted formal war games. There is no evidence in palace records or military archives that strategic exercises or tactical planning sessions occurred in that specific room. The hall's acoustics and scale made it unsuitable for confidential discussions. Its ceremonial character made it inappropriate for technical work. But the broader palace complex, with its map rooms, studies, and private apartments, did host conversations where war was discussed as a possibility, a contingency, a scenario to be planned for. The Marble Hall's role was more symbolic than operational. It was the space where the same men who planned for war dined in splendor, their boots echoing on the inlaid floor, their voices amplified by the painted dome. The floor, during these years, bore the footsteps of men for whom maneuvers were a way of life. Generals who had spent careers training for hypothetical conflicts, diplomats who negotiated alliances predicated on mutual military support. monarchs who reviewed troops and approved mobilization plans. The stone patterns, unchanged since 1769, recorded none of this explicitly. But conservation reports from later decades note where concentrated in specific paths, from entrance to center, from periphery to focus, suggesting patterns of use consistent with formal receptions and ceremonial events. The floor became, in this sense, a physical archive of movement, a record of how bodies navigated a space designed to choreograph their behavior. What the Marble Hall did, more than facilitate strategy, was normalize the aesthetics of war. The room's mythological paintings, the rape of Helen, the sacrifice of Iphigenia, depicted violence as the necessary prelude to destiny. The ceiling's Ganymede ascending to Olympus suggested that elevation required seizure, that greatness involved force. These were 18th-century Baroque tropes not intended as military propaganda. But in the context of early 20th-century militarism, they acquired new resonance. The same cultural framework that celebrated heroic violence in classical mythology could extend that celebration to modern warfare. The Marble Hall did not cause this mindset, but it reflected and reinforced it. Memoirs and diplomatic documents from the period described the atmosphere at the Neues Palais in the months before the war. There was confidence, even bravado. Germany's military machine was the most advanced in Europe. The general staff had spent decades refining mobilization plans. Maneuvers had demonstrated the army's readiness. The assumption, widespread among Germany's leadership, was that if war came, it would be swift, decisive, and controllable. The Neues Palais, where these men dined and deliberated, embodied that assumption. The building had survived for more than a century, a monument to Prussian resilience. Why should the regime it housed be any less durable? The echo of boots on the Marble Hall's inlaid floor became, in retrospect, a kind of metaphorical war game. These were men rehearsing for a conflict they believed they understood. The floor's curves guided their steps just as strategic plans guided their thinking, both designed to produce order, both imposing patterns on what would prove to be chaos. The hall was not a war room, but it belonged to a world that treated war as a spectacle that could still be controlled, a maneuver that could be won with sufficient preparation and will. At the Neues Palais, peacetime felt like a rehearsal. The Marble Hall was not a war room, but it belonged to a world that treated war as a spectacle that could still be controlled. The men who dined beneath its dome believed they were preparing for triumph. They did not yet know they were rehearsing for the catastrophe. In late July of 1914, as Europe slid toward war, the Neues Palais became a focal point for decision-making. Historians have documented crucial crown councils and ministerial meetings held at the palace during the July crisis, where Wilhelm II and his advisors assessed telegrams, ultimatums, and the cascading failures of diplomacy. The palace's role in these events is well established in diplomatic histories and memoirs, though the precise locations of specific conversations within the sprawling complex are often uncertain. What is clear is that the Neues Palais was not merely a backdrop, but an active setting where the German leadership deliberated the choices that would lead to the First World War. Memoirs describe conversations in the park surrounding the palace. Wilhelm walked with Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg and Undersecretary Zimmermann along the manicured paths, discussing Austria's ultimatum to Serbia, Russia's mobilization, and Germany's obligations under the dual alliance. The contrast between the serene surroundings, formal gardens, sculpted hedges, the distant facade of the palace glowing in summer light, and the gravity of the discussions appears repeatedly in these accounts. It was as if the physical beauty of the setting made the catastrophe unfolding in telegrams and diplomatic cables feel less real, less immediate. On the 1st and 2nd of August, 1914, Wilhelm received generals and ministers at the palace as Germany moved from crisis to mobilization. The state of imminent danger of war was declared. Orders went out to military commands across the empire. Scholars who have studied the German decision-making process describe the Neues Palais during these days as the nerve center of an empire lurching toward conflict. Yet the palace itself, its architecture, its rooms, its routines, continued as if nothing had changed. Servants prepared meals. Gardeners tended the grounds. The marble hall stood as it always had, its chandeliers unlit, its floor empty. The hall's role during the July crisis and the opening days of the war was defined more by absence than presence. While decisions were made in adjacent rooms, in Wilhelm's study, in conference chambers, and in the gardens, the marble hall remained unused. There are no records of meetings held there during this period, no photographs of uniformed officers gathered beneath the dome. The room that had been designed to impress Europe, to amplify voices and project power, stood silent. Its inlaid floor caught only the shifting patterns of sunlight through the high windows, unchanged by the urgency of nearby voices. This silence is worth noting. The marble hall had been built for moments of triumph, for banquets celebrating victories, for receptions marking diplomatic successes. It was not designed for the messy, anxious work of crisis management. The room's scale and formality made it unsuitable for the rapid exchanges, the telephone calls, the constant flow of telegrams that characterized decision-making in August 1914. The actual work of going to war occurred in smaller, more functional spaces. The marble hall, with all its grandeur, had nothing to contribute. Yet its presence in the palace complex mattered symbolically. The men making decisions about mobilization and war were surrounded by architecture that celebrated military victory. They worked in a building commissioned by Frederick the Great to boast of Prussian survival after the 7 Years' War. The marble hall, even when empty, served as a reminder of what the palace represented, the belief that Prussia, and now Germany, could overcome existential threats through will, organization, and force. The room did not need to be used. Its mere existence reinforced a mindset. Diplomatic collections preserved in archives describe the Star Chamber of the Neues Palais, a phrase used by some contemporaries to characterize the palace as a place where fateful decisions were made behind closed doors. The phrase carries a weight of accusation, the Star Chamber being a historical symbol of arbitrary power, but also reflects the palace's role in the public imagination. It was known as a center of imperial authority, a place where Wilhelm and his inner circle shaped Germany's course. Whether the decisions made there were wise or reckless became a subject of bitter debate in the years that followed. One detail from memoirs stands out: the contrast between the palace's beauty and the horror being set in motion. Bethmann Hollweg, walking in the gardens with Wilhelm, reportedly paused to look back at the Neues Palais, its façade bathed in evening light. The building, with its dome and statues and endless rows of windows, appeared unchanging, solid, permanent. Within hours, orders would be issued that would send millions of men to the trenches. The palace would remain standing. The world it represented would not. The marble hall's emptiness during the July crisis and the outbreak of war becomes, in retrospect, a kind of statement. Architecture built to celebrate victory was irrelevant in the face of decisions that would produce catastrophe. The room's inlaid floor, designed to bear the weight of triumphant monarchs and awed ambassadors, bore nothing during the most consequential days in the palace's history. It was simply there, a beautiful, useless space, while history moved past it. Later, historical analyses would emphasize the disconnect between the German leadership's assumptions and the reality they faced. They believed they were managing a crisis. They were unleashing a continental war. They believed Germany's military superiority would ensure swift victory. They were initiating 4 years of grinding attrition. They believed the world they knew, the world of maneuvers and banquets and crown councils in Baroque palaces, would survive the conflict. They were wrong. The marble hall, standing empty during those August days, prefigured what was to come, a symbol of power rendered irrelevant by forces it could not contain. When orders were signed at the Neues Palais, the marble hall stood still. Its inlaid arcs and mythological paintings remained unchanged. It was the world beyond its walls that would be shattered. The floor, waiting in silence, would soon record a different kind of history. Not the triumph the room had been built to celebrate, but the slow unraveling of the empire it had been meant to glorify. During the First World War, the Neues Palais entered a strange liminal state. It remained technically an imperial residence, but Wilhelm II spent increasingly little time there. His role as supreme warlord required him to be near the front, or at least near military headquarters. For much of the war, he resided at Pless in Silesia, later at Spa in Belgium, locations chosen for their proximity to the armies. Under his nominal command, the Neues Palais, meanwhile, continued as a symbolic address, a place where the imperial family maintained a presence but no longer a center of power or decision-making. The palace itself did not suffer the physical destruction that befell so much of Europe. Potsdam was far from the front lines. No bombs fell on the marble hall, no artillery shattered its windows. The building survived the war structurally intact, a fact that would prove significant in later decades. But survival without purpose is its own form of decline. The palace that had hosted grand banquets and diplomatic receptions now stood mostly empty. Staff were reduced as men were drafted into military service. Maintenance budgets shrank as the war drained Germany's finances. Rooms that had been heated and lit and polished began to accumulate dust. Empress Augusta Victoria remained at the palace for portions of the war, though she too spent time elsewhere. Photographs from this period show her at charitable events, visiting hospitals, fulfilling ceremonial duties expected of an empress in wartime. But the vitality that had characterized the palace during the pre-war years, the dinners, the receptions, the constant flow of visitors, had ceased. The Neues Palais became a place where an empress waited, where staff performed routines out of habit rather than necessity, where the architecture itself seemed to hold its breath. The Marble Hall, designed for spectacle, hosted few events during the war. There were no state dinners, no visiting monarchs to impress. The long banquet table remained stored away. The chandeliers, electrified at such expense only a decade earlier, were left dark to conserve resources. The inlaid floor, once polished weekly to maintain its gleam, was cleaned less frequently. The stone patterns remained intact, but the room's atmosphere shifted. It became a space defined by absence rather than presence, by what was no longer happening within it. Palace records from the war years document this slow erosion. Maintenance reports note repairs deferred, restoration projects postponed. Inventories list furnishings moved to storage or sent elsewhere. Financial accounts show declining expenditures, not because the palace required less upkeep, but because less money was available. The war consumed everything: resources, labor, attention. A Baroque palace in Potsdam, no matter how grand, could not compete for priority with the logistical demands of a continental conflict. Public and political support for the monarchy eroded as the war dragged on. The initial wave of patriotic enthusiasm that had greeted the August mobilization gave way to exhaustion, disillusionment, and anger. Casualties mounted into the millions. The naval blockade brought hunger to German cities. The promise of swift victory, confidently asserted in 1914, proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. By 1917, strikes and protests spread across Germany. By 1918, the military situation had become untenable. The army that had been Germany's pride, the institution that Wilhelm had styled himself to lead, was collapsing. In November 1918, revolution came. Sailors mutinied at Kiel. Workers' councils seized control of cities. The monarchy, which had ruled Prussia for centuries and Germany for nearly 5 decades, lost legitimacy almost overnight. Wilhelm II, confronted with demands for his abdication, initially resisted, but the collapse was total. On November 9th, the Republic was proclaimed in Berlin. Wilhelm, urged by his generals to avoid civil war, agreed to abdicate and fled to the Netherlands. The Neues Palais, which he had made his principal residence, ceased to be an imperial home. The palace during those final days of the monarchy exists in fragmented accounts. Some staff remained, uncertain of their status or future. Others left, seeking employment elsewhere as the old regime dissolved. The imperial family's personal belongings were hastily packed. Decisions had to be made about what would go into exile, what would remain, what belonged to the state, and what to the Hohenzollerns personally. These were not simple questions. The line between state property and family heirlooms had always been blurred in a monarchy. The Marble Hall witnessed none of this directly. The room stood empty during the Revolution, its doors likely closed, its space irrelevant to the political upheaval unfolding beyond the palace gates. But its emptiness now carried a different meaning. For a century and a half, the hall's periodic disuse had been temporary, a pause between performances. Now, the emptiness felt permanent. There would be no more banquets, no more visiting monarchs, no more imperial ceremonies. The room had been built to project eternal power. That power had lasted precisely 149 years from the hall's completion to the empire's collapse. The floor, in those final months of 1918, remained as Frederick the Great had designed it. Inlaid stone in rococo curves, technically intact, aesthetically unchanged. But the context that gave it meaning had vanished. The monarchs were gone. The empire was gone. The belief that architecture could secure permanence had been revealed as fantasy. The marble hall became, in an instant, a monument to a world that no longer existed. Augusta Victoria, whose health had declined during the war years, would die in 1921 in exile at Husdoorn in the Netherlands. Wilhelm would survive until 1941, spending his final decades in a Dutch estate filled with furniture shipped from Potsdam and Berlin. The Neues Palais, stripped of its imperial family, passed into the custody of the Prussian state. The revolution had not destroyed the building. It had simply removed the people who had given it purpose. In wartime, the new palace did not crumble. It simply lost its audience. Its greatest hall remained intact, but the world it had been built to impress was dying in the trenches. The floor's inlaid patterns, designed to overwhelm ambassadors and courtiers, now reflected only the footsteps of caretakers moving through rooms that no longer belonged to kings. After the November Revolution of 1918, the Neues Palais underwent a transformation as profound as any in its history. It ceased to be a royal residence and became instead state property. The legal and administrative processes that governed this transition were complex. The Hohenzollern family, though stripped of political power, retained claims to certain properties and possessions. Negotiations between the family and the Prussian government dragged on for years, involving questions of ownership, compensation, and historical precedent. The Neues Palais, as one of the most significant royal properties, stood at the center of these disputes. Wilhelm II, in exile at Husdoorn in the Netherlands, sought to retain as much of the imperial collection as possible. Between 1918 and the early 1920s, a massive transfer of property occurred. Furniture, artworks, porcelain, tapestries, and personal belongings were shipped from Potsdam and Berlin to Husdoorn in approximately 64 railway carriages. The scale of this operation reflects both the extent of the imperial collections and the determination of the exiled monarch to preserve some material connection to his former status. Husdoorn, a relatively modest Dutch estate, became overwhelmed with objects from palaces built for entirely different scales of living. The Neues Palais, meanwhile, was stripped of much of its movable content. Inventories from this period document the removals: chairs, tables, cabinets, paintings not integrated into the architectural fabric, personal effects, and decorative objects. What remained were the elements that could not easily be transported: the fixed architectural decoration, the built-in furniture, the ceiling paintings, the inlaid floor. The marble hall retained its colossal columns, its dome, its mythological canvases by Van Loo, and its 600-square-metre stone floor. But the room's character changed. What had been a furnished, functioning space became an architectural shell, beautiful but emptied of the objects that had made it livable. Under the Weimar Republic, the decision was made to open the Neues Palais as a museum. This was not a revolutionary act, but a pragmatic one. The building was too large and expensive to maintain as a private residence, even if a buyer could be found. Its historical significance made demolition unthinkable. Conversion to museum use offered a solution. The palace could be preserved, made accessible to the public, and funded through ticket sales and state support. By the mid-1920s, visitors could tour the Marble Hall and other state rooms, guided by custodians who explained the architecture, the artworks, and the history. The transformation from residence to museum altered the Marble Hall's function fundamentally. where once the inlaid floor had borne the weight of emperors, courtiers, and diplomats, it now supported the slower, more cautious footsteps of tourists. Velvet ropes and wooden barriers directed traffic, protecting the most vulnerable areas of the floor from excessive wear. Visitors were instructed not to touch the walls, not to photograph certain objects, not to stray from designated paths. The room that had been designed to overwhelm now existed to educate, and education required control. Early museum catalogs and guidebooks from this period described the Marble Hall with a mixture of admiration and detachment. The rhetoric of imperial grandeur had become unfashionable in Republican Germany. Guides acknowledged the room's beauty, its technical accomplishment, and the skill of its craftsmen. But they avoided celebrating the monarchs who had commissioned it. The Neues Palais was presented as a cultural heritage, not a political monument. This reframing was delicate work, requiring curators to preserve the building while distancing it from the regime that had fallen. The floor itself became an object of particular fascination for museum visitors. With furniture removed and traffic controlled, the inlaid patterns were fully visible for the first time in decades. Guidebooks described the stone's origins, the techniques of cutting and fitting, the visual effect of the curves and colors. Visitors stood at the edges of the room, looking across the expanse of patterned stone, marveling at craftsmanship that predated industrialization. The floor, which Frederick the Great had intended as a symbol of power, was now appreciated primarily as a work of art. But the transition to museum use was incomplete. Parts of the Neues Palais complex were repurposed for other functions. Offices occupied some wings, storage filled others. The palace became, in effect, a hybrid, part museum, part administrative facility, part vacant monument. This fragmentation reflected the broader uncertainty of the Weimar period. The Republic had inherited an empire's worth of palaces and monuments, but lacked the resources or the ideological clarity to know what to do with them all. Photographs from the 1920s and 30s show the Marble Hall in this transitional state. The room appears clean, maintained, but also strangely static. There are no people in most images, just empty space and architecture. The chandeliers hang dark. Artificial lighting for photography was still rudimentary. The floor gleams, polished by staff who understood their job, was no longer to prepare for banquets, but to preserve a relic. The atmosphere in these photographs is neither triumphant nor mournful. It is simply a documentary, recording a space whose meaning had become uncertain. Wilhelm II, following news of the palace's conversion from exile, reportedly expressed bitterness. The palace he had modernized and loved, the Marble Hall where he had hosted Europe's monarchs, was now a ticketed attraction. But his complaints had no force. He was a private citizen in a foreign country, stripped of authority, surviving on a pension and the goodwill of the Dutch government. The Neues Palais, like the empire it had represented, no longer belonged to him. By the late 1920s, the Marble Hall no longer belonged to a living monarchy. It belonged to ticket holders, curators, and dustcloths, a monument recast as an exhibit of a vanished world. The floor that had been meant to intimidate ambassadors now impressed tourists. The dome that had amplified an emperor's voice now echoed the quiet explanations of museum guides. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The room remained intact, but everything it had been built to do, to project power, to overwhelm visitors, to anchor a regime, had become impossible. It could only be observed, studied, and remembered. The stone survived, but its purpose had been archived. The Second World War brought a new wave of threat and loss to the Neues Palais, though of a different character than the political upheaval of 1918. Potsdam, as a historic city near Berlin, suffered heavy bombing during the Allied campaigns of 1944 and 1945. The city's residential districts, rail yards, and industrial sites were targeted repeatedly. The historic center was devastated. Churches, civic buildings, and older neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Yet, the Neues Palais, located in the western reaches of the city within the protected park landscape of Sanssouci, largely escaped direct destruction. The palace's survival was not the result of any particular protective effort, but of geography and chance. What the palace could not escape was looting. As Soviet forces entered Potsdam in April and May of 1945, the palaces of Sanssouci became targets for systematic removal of artworks, furnishings, and decorative objects. The Neues Palais, though already partially emptied during its museum phase, still contained significant collections. Paintings were taken from walls, furniture was loaded onto trucks, porcelain, silver, and smaller decorative objects disappeared into the chaotic aftermath of conquest. Some pieces would eventually surface in Soviet museums, catalogued as war trophies. Others vanished entirely, lost in the disorder of occupation, theft, and dispersal. The Marble Hall itself, because of its fixed architectural elements, suffered less than more portable spaces. The dome paintings could not easily be removed. The inlaid floor, though theoretically extractable, would have required enormous effort to dismantle without destroying it. The colossal columns were integral to the structure. What could be taken, movable furnishings, smaller artworks, decorative objects, was taken. What remained were the bones of the room: walls, floor, ceiling, columns. The Marble Hall survived as architecture, but was stripped of much that had made it a furnished space. Meanwhile, a parallel story unfolded in the Netherlands. The furniture and objects Wilhelm II had shipped to Huisdoorn remained largely in crates, stored in outbuildings and attics. Wilhelm had died in 1941. His widow survived until 1947. After her death, the Dutch estate and its contents entered a legal and administrative limbo. Huisdoorn became property of the Dutch state, but the German objects within it remained connected to the Hohenzollern family, and by extension, to the German palaces from which they had come. For decades, this situation persisted. The crates at Huisdoorn were known to contain significant collections, but the political and legal complexities of restitution during and after the Cold War made resolution difficult. Germany was divided. Potsdam lay in the German Democratic Republic under Soviet control. The Prussian palaces, including the Neues Palais, were managed by East German authorities with little interest in reclaiming furnishings associated with the imperial past. The furniture remained in the Netherlands, largely forgotten except by specialists and historians. In the 1970s, the situation began to shift. Dutch authorities rediscovered the extent of the Huisdoorn collections and initiated negotiations with German preservation agencies. By this time, Cold War tensions had eased slightly, and cultural diplomacy became a tool for building connections across the divide. In a series of agreements spanning the late 1970s and early 1980s, significant portions of the imperial furnishings were returned to Potsdam. The restitution was not complete. Some objects remained in the Netherlands, either as part of Huisdoorn's own museum displays or because their provenance was disputed, but enough material came back to allow for meaningful restoration of the Neues Palais interiors. The return of these objects enabled a project that had been impossible during the immediate post-war decades, restoring the Neues Palais, including the Marble Hall, to something approximating its appearance in 1918. Photographs taken before the First World War provided visual documentation. Inventories listed what furniture had been in which rooms. With the returned pieces and careful reconstruction, conservators could reassemble interiors that had been scattered for more than half a century. The Marble Hall's restoration focused on structural and decorative conservation. The inlaid floor, though it had survived both wars physically intact, showed signs of wear, micro-cracking, and surface damage accumulated over 2 centuries. Conservation teams undertook painstaking cleaning, using techniques that removed grime and oxidation without damaging the stone. Areas where joints had loosened were resecured. Sections with hairline cracks were stabilized. The work required months of labor by specialists in stone conservation, working on their knees across 600 square meters of patterned surface. Restoration reports from this period describe the floor as remarkably resilient. Despite 2 world wars, despite decades as a museum, despite the neglect of the immediate post-war years, the fundamental integrity of the inlaid pattern remained. The black and white bands still curved in their Rococo arabesques. The colored stones, gray, cream, pale green, still formed their intricate borders. What had been lost was not the design but the surface perfection, Scratches, scuffs, and worn areas marked paths where visitors had walked, where furniture had been dragged, where history had literally inscribed itself into the stone. The conservator's task was not to erase this history, but to stabilize it, to prevent further degradation while accepting that the floor would never again look as it had in 1769. Photographs comparing the marble hall before and after restoration show the transformation. In images from the 1950s and 60s, the room appears dim, dusty, its colors muted. In images from the 1980s and 90s, after restoration, the space glows with renewed clarity. The floor's patterns are sharp, the paintings cleaned and consolidated, the gilding refreshed. The room had been returned, as much as was possible, to its intended visual impact. Yet, it could not be returned to its original purpose. It remained a museum exhibit, a space for observation rather than use. The Marble Hall survived 2 world wars, not because it was sacred, but because chance and logistics favored it. The empire it once served did not return, but its floor did, polished again, now for a different kind of gaze. The stone had outlasted the monarchs who walked it, the empire that built it, and the wars that might have destroyed it. What remained was not power, but evidence, a surface that recorded the ambition of one age and the survival of another. By the late 20th century, the Neues Palais had entered a new phase of its existence, not as a residence, not as an active symbol of power, but as a curated historical site. The palace became part of the Stiftung Preußische Schlösser und Gärten Berlin-Brandenburg, the foundation responsible for managing the former Prussian royal properties across the Berlin-Potsdam region. Under this administration, the building's meaning shifted decisively from monument to case study, from symbol to artifact. Historians, curators, and conservators replaced courtiers and diplomats as the primary interpreters of the space. Portions of the palace complex found new uses that Frederick the Great would never have imagined. The communes, the 2 large service buildings that flanked the palace forecourt, were converted to house the University of Potsdam. Students walked corridors once used by imperial servants. Lecture halls occupied spaces designed for storage and kitchens. The juxtaposition was jarring to some observers, appropriate to others. It demonstrated that buildings, no matter how purposefully designed, could be adapted to entirely different functions once their original context disappeared. The Marble Hall itself remained primarily a museum space, preserved and interpreted for visitors. But the interpretive framework had evolved significantly from the cautious neutrality of the Weimar-era guidebooks. By the late 20th century, scholars felt comfortable engaging critically with the palace's history. Exhibition texts explicitly referenced Frederick the Great's fanfaronade remark, framing the Neues Palais as a deliberate, self-conscious exercise in propaganda. The building was not presented as an inevitable expression of monarchical power, but as a strategic choice, an architectural argument made for specific political purposes. This reframing extended to Wilhelm II's use of the palace. Exhibitions and publications emphasized his love of bombast, his theatrical personality, his need for grand stages on which to perform imperial authority. The Marble Hall appeared in these narratives as the perfect setting for a ruler whose politics and aesthetics alike favored excess. The room's over-the-top decoration, its amplifying acoustics, its sheer scale, all were read as mirrors of Wilhelm's psychology. The palace had not made Wilhelm bombastic, but it had provided him with an environment that encouraged and facilitated that tendency. UNESCO's designation of the palaces and parks of Potsdam and Berlin as a World Heritage Site in 1990 added another layer of meaning. The designation emphasized cultural and civilizational value rather than political supremacy. The Neues Palais was no longer primarily a Prussian or German monument, but part of humanity's shared architectural heritage. This framing had the effect of softening the building's nationalist associations. It became easier to appreciate the craftsmanship, the aesthetic achievement, without endorsing the regime that had commissioned it. Visitors to the Marble Hall in this period encountered a carefully curated experience. Guided tours explained the room's history, its architecture, and its decoration. The inlaid floor was often highlighted as a technical and artistic masterpiece, a demonstration of Baroque skill and ambition. Guides described the stone's origins, the process of cutting and fitting, the visual effect of the patterns. The floor's political meaning, its original function as a tool of intimidation, was acknowledged but de-emphasized in favor of aesthetic appreciation. The stone curves that once forced courtiers to lower their gaze before approaching the throne were now admired as examples of decorative art. This shift from intimidation to admiration reflects a broader pattern in how societies relate to monuments after the regimes that built them have fallen. The architecture survives, but its capacity to inspire fear or awe diminishes. What remains is the material object: stone, paint, gilt. Visitors can appreciate the craftsmanship without feeling the political weight that the original context imposed. The marble hall became, in this sense, safer. It was no longer threatened. It simply existed, beautiful and historically significant, but politically inert. Yet the building's history could not be entirely neutralized. Scholarly publications and museum exhibitions continued to grapple with what the palace represented. The fanfaronade, after all, had not been innocent. It was architecture as propaganda, built to project power and to normalize the idea that one family, one state, deserved to dominate others. The beauty of the marble hall did not erase the arrogance of its conception. The skill of the craftsman who laid the floor did not redeem the political system that commissioned it. Curators and historians working on the Neues Palais in the late 20th and early 21st centuries increasingly emphasized these tensions. Exhibition catalogs presented the palace not as a straightforward aesthetic achievement, but as a complicated historical artifact. The same beauty that attracts visitors also raises questions. Why was so much wealth concentrated in one building? What social and economic systems made such concentration possible? How did the display of grandeur serve to legitimize inequality? The marble hall, in these exhibitions, became a prompt for reflection rather than a simple object of admiration. The floor, in this new interpretive context, retained its power as a visual anchor. Conservation efforts had returned it to near original condition, and its patterns remained as striking as ever. But guides now pointed out that the floor's purpose had been to overwhelm, to force visitors to navigate a space designed to make them feel small. The beauty was real, but it was beauty in service of domination. Recognizing both aspects, the aesthetic achievement and the political function became central to how the marble hall was presented. Where courtiers once whispered flattery, guidebooks now whispered footnotes. The same marble that once supported imperial performances now supported explanations of why those performances mattered and why they failed. The room had not changed physically, but the stories told about it had multiplied. Frederick's fanfaronade, Wilhelm's bombast, the July crisis, the collapse of the empire, the museum transformation, the wartime looting and post-war restoration. Each layer of history added complexity, turning the marble hall from a simple monument into a palimpsest of meanings. The inlaid floor, polished and preserved, continued to guide visitors' eyes in slow curves. But what they saw when they looked down had changed. Some saw masterful stonework, others saw evidence of excess, still others saw a surface that had outlived empires, a material record of how even the most confident declarations of permanence eventually become museum exhibits. All of these readings were true. The floor, like the room that contained it, had become a text that could be read in multiple ways, none of them definitive, all of them revealing something about the relationship between architecture, power, and time. In the 21st century, the Neues Palais and its marble hall have become sites for ongoing conversations about memory, empire, and the responsibilities of preservation. Germany's broader reckoning with its imperial and militaristic past has extended to its architectural monuments. The palaces of Potsdam, including the Neues Palais, are no longer presented as uncomplicated treasures, but as complex artifacts that require critical engagement. Visitors today encounter interpretive materials that situate the buildings within histories of colonialism, militarism, and social inequality. Recent exhibitions have focused on the end of the Hohenzollern monarchy, using the Neues Palais as a narrative anchor for the events of November 1918. The Kaiser Dämmerung exhibition, Twilight of the Emperors, explored the collapse of the German Empire through objects, documents, and spatial reconstruction. The Marble Hall appeared in this context not as a symbol of timeless grandeur, but as a stage that had lost its actors. Photographs showed the room as it appeared in 1918, emptied of imperial presence, waiting for a new purpose it did not yet have. The exhibition asked visitors to imagine the moment when the room's original meaning dissolved, when architecture built to project eternal power became, overnight, evidence of power's fragility. Contemporary tours emphasize Wilhelm II's personality and its connection to the palace's theatricality. Guides describe his love of uniforms, parades, and dramatic gestures. They connect this aesthetic preference to the militarized culture of pre-war Germany, the Kaisermanöver and war games, the assumption that military power could be displayed and rehearsed like a theatrical performance. The Neues Palais, with its Baroque excess and modern infrastructure, becomes in these narratives a physical manifestation of Wilhelm's worldview, confident, bombastic, convinced of its own permanence, and ultimately catastrophically wrong. Wider debates about colonialism and monuments have also touched the Neues Palais. Germany's colonial empire, though smaller and shorter-lived than those of Britain or France, was brutal and exploitative. The wealth that built and maintained palaces like the Neues Palais came partly from systems of trade, labor, and extraction that extended globally. While the Neues Palais was built before Germany's formal colonial period, the Prussian and later German states that maintained it benefited from economic systems rooted in inequality. Exhibitions at the Humboldt Forum in Berlin and other institutions have explored these connections, asking how imperial architecture relates to imperial violence. The Marble Hall, in this context, becomes a space for asking uncomfortable questions. The beauty of the inlaid floor is undeniable. The skill of the craftsman who created it deserves recognition. But what enabled that beauty? Who paid for it, and what did they do to acquire the wealth? The stone itself is innocent, but the system that commissioned and maintained it was not. Visitors standing in the Marble Hall today are invited to hold both thoughts simultaneously: appreciation for aesthetic achievement and awareness of the social structures that made it possible. Social media and digital platforms have changed how the Marble Hall circulates in contemporary culture. Visitors photograph the floor from above, capturing the swirling patterns in images that emphasize abstract beauty over historical context. These photographs appear on Instagram, Pinterest, and travel blogs, often stripped of explanatory text. The Marble Hall becomes, in these contexts, a backdrop for selfies, a visually striking location divorced from its history. The room that was built to intimidate Europe is now just another beautiful space to document and share. Yet, even in these decontextualized images, the history persists. Comments on social media posts about the Neues Palais often reference Wilhelm II, the First World War, or the broader history of the German Empire. The architecture prompts questions. Why is this palace here? Who built it? What happened to the people who lived in it? The images may be aestheticized, but they still carry historical weight. The Marble Hall cannot be reduced to pure visual pleasure. Its context reasserts itself even in spaces designed for casual consumption. Museum programming has attempted to bridge the gap between aesthetic appreciation and critical historical engagement. Audio guides and digital apps provide layered information, allowing visitors to choose their level of detail. A casual tourist can admire the floor's beauty. A more engaged visitor can explore its political meanings. An academic can access detailed conservation reports and archival materials. The Marble Hall becomes different things to different audiences, its meanings multiplying rather than resolving into a single interpretation. Educational programs bring school groups through the Marble Hall, using the space to teach about monarchy, empire, and historical change. Students learn about Frederick the Great's wars, Wilhelm II's militarism, the First World War's origins, and the revolutions that ended the monarchical system. The floor beneath their feet serves as a physical anchor for these abstract historical processes. They can see, touch, and stand on a surface that has survived across epochs. History becomes not just textbook dates, but a material reality. In smartphone images, the marble hall is merely beautiful. In the archive, it is the polished stage of a regime that rehearsed for wars it could not control. Both views are true, neither is complete. The room exists in tension between these readings, refusing to settle into a single meaning. It is both masterpiece and monument to excess, both cultural heritage and evidence of inequality, both preserved treasure and site of critical questioning. The contemporary visitor experience reflects this multiplicity. On any given day, tour groups move through the marble hall on scheduled circuits. Guides deliver practiced explanations. Visitors nod, photograph, and move on. The room accommodates this flow efficiently, its roped pathways and timed entries, managing crowds while protecting the floor. But beneath the routine, the space retains a strange power. Even visitors who know nothing of its history often pause, made quiet by the scale and the light and the density of decoration. The marble hall today performs a function Frederick the Great never intended and Wilhelm II could not have imagined. It prompts reflection on the limits of architectural permanence and the inevitability of historical change. Every empire believes it will last forever. Every monument is built to defy time. The marble hall, standing intact after 256 years, seems to have succeeded. But its survival is not a triumph, it is a transformation. The room remains, but everything it was built to do has become impossible. It can no longer intimidate, no longer project power, no longer amplify an emperor's voice. It can only witness, preserve, and ask questions it cannot answer. Today, the marble hall stands restored, its dome and paintings stabilized, its 600-square-metre inlaid floor protected by velvet ropes and conservation protocols. Visitors enter in timed groups, their footsteps restricted to designated pathways that preserve the most vulnerable sections of the stone. The room still performs, but for history rather than power. Its acoustics amplify the soft explanations of museum guides instead of the proclamations of emperors. The chandeliers, electrified more than a century ago, glow with steady modern light. Sunlight filters through the tall windows, casting the same geometric patterns it has cast for 2.5 centuries. The space remains beautiful, technically intact, and visually overwhelming. But something fundamental has changed. The room that was designed to make visitors feel small now makes them feel contemplative. The floor that was meant to force ambassadors to acknowledge Prussian supremacy now invites tourists to admire craftsmanship. The dome painted with gods ascending to Olympus still suggests immortality, but the suggestion feels less like a promise and more like a question. Can anything human-made achieve permanence? Can architecture outlast the ambitions that built it? The inlaid marble floor provides the answer. It has outlived 2 empires, 3 political systems, 2 world wars, and countless human dramas. Its patterns remain exactly as Frederick the Great commissioned them in 1769. Black and white stone bands curving in Rococo arabesques, bordered by gray and cream and pale green, swirling across 600 square meters in designs that force the eye to follow their flow. The stone itself has proven durable beyond any reasonable expectation. The pattern has survived, but the meaning is not. When Frederick ordered this floor, he intended it as a declaration. Prussia is powerful. Prussia is wealthy. Prussia can afford to waste resources on beauty, and anyone who enters this room must acknowledge all of this before speaking to the king. When Wilhelm II modernized the chandeliers and hosted state dinners, the floor still carried that meaning, adapted for a new empire and a new century. The stone supported boasts, amplified egos, and reinforced hierarchies. Now, it supports museum placards and velvet ropes. The stone has not changed, but the world around it has changed so completely that the original meaning has become inaccessible. Visitors can read about what the floor was meant to do, but they cannot feel it. The room cannot intimidate a 21st century tourist the way it intimidated an 18th century diplomat. The architecture remains intact, but the power it was built to project has been archived. Conservation reports document this transformation in technical language. The floor shows wear patterns consistent with centuries of use, concentrated damage near doorways, lighter wear in the center, microscopic scratches recording the paths of countless footsteps. Restoration work has stabilized these traces without erasing them. The floor is not returned to pristine condition, but maintained in a state that acknowledges its history. The wear is part of the record, part of what makes the floor historically valuable rather than merely aesthetically pleasing. In this sense, the Marble Hall has become a monument to time itself, not to the empires that used it, not to the monarchs who walked it, but to the inexorable process by which all human ambitions are reduced to artifacts. Frederick the Great commissioned the room to prove that Prussia had survived the 7 Years' War and deserved recognition as a great power. Wilhelm II used it to project confidence and intimidate rivals. Both succeeded for a time, but the room has survived them both, and in surviving has become something neither intended, evidence of how nothing lasts. Visitors file through in groups of 20 or 30, their movements choreographed by guides and security staff. They listen to explanations of the architecture, the paintings, and the historical context. Most take photographs, trying to capture the space in a way that can be shared or remembered. Some pause longer, looking up at the dome or down at the floor, trying to process the scale and the beauty and the strangeness of standing in a room built for purposes that no longer exist. The floor accepts all of this with geological patience. Stone does not care about human interpretations. The marble and granite and limestone that make up the inlaid patterns will outlast the current museum framework as surely as they outlasted the empire. Eventually, the tourist economy that justifies preservation funding will change. Eventually, the political and cultural priorities that currently protect the Neues Palais will shift. Eventually, some future generation will look at this building and see something different again. But for now, in the early 21st century, the Marble Hall exists in a peculiar state of suspended meaning. It is neither fully alive nor fully archived. It functions as a museum space, but it retains an atmosphere that exceeds museological explanation. Something about the scale, the light, the density of decoration, the echo of footsteps on stone. Something continues to affect visitors in ways that resist easy interpretation. The room was built to overwhelm, and it still does, even though the specific political meanings that justified the overwhelming have dissolved. What remains on the marble floor is not power but pattern, not an empire but evidence, not certainty but questions. The curves still guide the eye, the colors still catch the light, the stone still reflects the movement of people across its surface. But the people are different now, the purpose is different, the meaning's different. The floor endures as a physical object while everything else transforms. In the marble hall of the Neues Palais, time has not destroyed the boast. It has emptied it. The dome still carries Ganymede toward an imagined Olympus. The chandeliers still multiply the light. The inlaid floor still leads the eye in slow, circling patterns. What has vanished are the certainties that justified such splendor. Frederick's fanfaronade, Wilhelm's bombast, the crowds of courtiers and guests, all survive only in documents and photographs and the fading memories of museum narratives. The hall remains, not as a triumph over time, but as evidence of our urge to resist it. Every visitor who pauses on that patterned stone becomes part of its archive, another fleeting presence recorded by a room that was built to be permanent and has instead become a monument to how nothing is. If even a hall built to intimidate a continent can end as a careful exhibit in a quiet park, what does that say about every monument we build to outlast ourselves?